Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the series on international relations. Um, I've decided to update the series by adding some of the newer international relations theories that have been developed. Um, and one of the most prominent of those is, of course, the rise of conservatism and neoconservatism when it comes to international relations. So, what do we mean when we talk about neoconservatism? Well, first and foremost, when we talk about neoconservatism, we need to introduce conservatism. So, what's conservatism, at least when it comes to political thinking? Well, the modern ideas surrounding conservatism really come out of the French Revolution, and they're based on the writings of English author Edmund Burke, who viewed the French Revolution with a combination of shocked horror and fear. You see, he views the outcome of the French Revolution, the Great Terror, the guillotines, and so on and so forth, as deeply disturbing. And until Burke came along, you have to understand that conservatism went hand in hand with monarchism. To be a conservative meant to value having a monarchy, having a king, having a queen. But after the French Revolution, this wasn't really a tenable position to have anymore. And so instead, Burke flips it. Conservatism should be a movement that values stability over all other considerations. So he looks at the instability that follows the French Revolution as something to be absolutely avoided. Unlike realists, if you remember, realists get their inspiration from Hobbes. And so for them, chaos, instability, this is something that is more or less natural. Conservatives vehemently disagree. Chaos is not natural. It is instead the product of bad or ineffective government or decadent societies. And because grand scale societal change isn't always positive, as we saw in the French Revolution, it should be avoided at all costs unless it is absolutely apparent that change is necessary. However, classical conservatism doesn't have an equivalent in IR theory. Most classical conservatives have aligned themselves with the realist or the neo-realist schools. Neoconservatism comes out of something very different. Now, when I say neoconservatism, there is an event in particular that is most closely associated with the rise of neoconservatism, and that event is 9/11. 9/11 is the glaring example that neocons point to. And when talking about conservatism in IR, 9/11 is an example simply because it demonstrates that standard conservatism, the goals that standard conservatives put in, valuing stability, eschewing change as much as possible, is not really tenable. The world is inherently unstable. And so standard conservatism sort of dies on the vine when looking at the world as a whole. However, neoconservatism sort of embraces that search for instability. It is one of the newest approaches to the study of IR. And what it does is it essentially shows that the focus on stability over all other considerations was no longer feasible. And instead, what neoconservatism tries to do is tries to counter both liberalism and realism, with liberals being considered too hesitant to engage in military action, rather dealing with economic action instead, and the latter too willing to retrench, too naive to go out and proactively deal with threats to the nation. And I think it's fair to say that discussions of neoconservatism really can't be separated from the policy of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration that went from 2000 to 2008, in which quite a few major neoconservative thinkers, such as Condoleezza Rice, David Frum, and John Bolton, were all hired by the White House and were all working within the White House in crafting policy. Now, again, based on the name, based on what we've talked about, you might be thinking, okay, neoconservatism must have developed out of conservatism the way neorealism developed out of realism, or neoliberalism developed out of liberalism. Well, you would be incorrect. Neoconservatism, in fact, has its origin in one of the most unlikely of places. Soviet Russia, after the death of Lenin. All right, Lenin is an author that we've looked at as part of this series before. But in the aftermath of the death of Lenin, something rather curious happens. The party begins to discuss what the future is going to look like. Who is going to be the future leader of the Soviet Union? And in this electoral intra-party process, 3 candidates emerge. However, realistically, we only care about 2 of them. These candidates were Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Bukharin. Now, Bukharin we don't really care about. Bukharin goes on to form the basis for Chinese communism, but for the purpose of our discussion, we talk about the key divide between Stalinists and Trotskyists. Because the thing that these 2 leaders disagree on the most is intervention. Intervention. Should we, as communists, go out into the world and seek to impose our system on other countries? Should we intervene to promote the expansion of communism? Now, Stalin disagreed. Stalin pushed for a policy that he referred to as socialism in one country, a policy that we would, in international relations terms, broadly associate with realism. Trotsky, by contrast, was pushing for an internationalist revolution. And many of the early neoconservatives of the late 50s and 60s were, in fact, former Trotskyists, the most prominent of whom is one Irving Kristol, is the ideological godfather of neoconservatism. And ideologically, he's a Trotskyist. He is an anti-Soviet leftist. He views the rise of Stalinism in the Soviet Union as a bit of a cancer on leftism as a whole. So this man is a former Trotskyist. And so, as realism begins to die down and becomes superseded in the 70s by liberalism, Kristol decides to take some of the aspects of neoliberalism in particular, on the creation of democracies, with the more grounded approach that he saw in realism, the military approach. And what comes out of it is a political theory that, based on its name, harkens back to conservatism, but also takes some key aspects of both liberalism and realism. For neocons, the goal is to promote democracies and democratization even more than neoliberals do. You will recall when we talked about democratic peace theory that neoliberals love to spread democracy, but there are certain lines that they won't cross to get there. In fact, neoliberals will accept temporary compromise on those ideals in order to promote democratization. So think, for example, during the Obama era, we began to open up relationships with Cuba, right? We did not do so because we loved the Castro regime or because we are big fans of Cuba. We did so because we believed that our economic system was a bit of a Trojan horse. that by sending our products to places like Cuba, and in the aftermath of the Iran nuclear deal, to places like Iran, as we begin to spread our economic system to places that were not friendly to us, that we would one day turn these countries friendly to us and push democratization into these countries through the use of our soft power. Neocons view this as an awful idea. This is anathema. You can't do this. Neocons believe that when you meet your enemies on this kind of level, you are simultaneously legitimizing them and putting aside your values and making the world less stable, not more stable. Neocons believe that democratization should be achieved through military power, military force. And there's a pretty simple reason why. I think we all agree that democracy, it's a good thing. And so neocons believe that democracy is such a good thing, is such a good thing for so many people that it should be enforced whenever and however possible. It is not the democracies of the world that lead to global instability, but dictatorships and non-democratic radical governments that lead to global instability. And so neocons believe that these kinds of governments need to be eradicated whenever and however possible. These are weeds in the garden and need to be removed. This is best encapsulated with their motto, peace through strength. We achieve peace by projecting our strength and our values into the world system. And because neocons focus on military power, they equally reject liberalism and neoliberalism's focus on all of these other actors. They reject the validity of international institutions. They reject the validity of the UN as more than just a diplomatic body. The only actors that matter for neocons are indeed states. But here's where they differ from realism in a pretty strong way. If you'll recall, one of the key things that made realism's balancing of power systems work was the idea that realism viewed power as zero-sum. Power is relative. There's a finite amount of power in the world, and therefore power can be balanced. Neocons reject this idea entirely. You can never truly balance the system because the world is not a zero-sum game. If a country that is hostile to you achieves a nuclear weapon, they may still be weaker relative to you, but that doesn't mean that they are not a threat. That does not mean that they cannot hurt you in a very real way. Power is not zero-sum. Military power is not relative. Military power is absolute. Balance of power is a fantasy. The only way that the world system can be balanced and that we can achieve some level of stability in the world system is to achieve total hegemony of one country and its ideals. And most neoconservatives, being Americans, believe that that country should be the United States. The only way to stabilize the system, according to the neoconservative viewpoint, is to dominate that system. The only way for the United States to live in a world system that is stable is for the United States to go out and completely dominate it. Crystal argues in the neoconservative persuasion that neoconservative attitudes can be summarized in the following theses. First, patriotism is a natural and healthy sentiment. and should be encouraged by both public and private institutions. Precisely because we are a nation of immigrants, this is also a powerful, uniquely American sentiment. Second, world government is a terrible idea, since it can lead to world tyranny. Therefore, international institutions that point to an ultimate world government should be regarded with the deepest suspicion, right? Countries should be advocating for themselves, countries should be patriotic, and should be wary of international institutions. Third, and this is the big one, statements should, above all, have the ability to distinguish friends from enemies. This is not as easy as it sounds, as the history of the Cold War has revealed. The number of intelligent men who could not count the Soviet Union as an enemy, I apologize for the typo, even though this was its own self-definition, was absolutely astonishing. Neoconservatives argue that one of the biggest things we need to be able to do in international relations is to figure out what countries are hostile to us and which ones are friendly to us, and act accordingly. You know, there is often this saying, this proverb that says, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And this is a tenet that is pretty widely held, especially in liberal circles. Neoconservatives argue you make peace with your friends and you destroy your enemies, and then they become your friends. This is the argument that Crystal makes. So an example of neoconservative thinking in this regard would be, think of U.S.-Japan relations. U.S.-Japan relations have not always been friendly. In fact, we were at war for most of World War II. However, what we did not try to do is seek to make peace with Imperial Japan. We did not attempt to approach this imperial militaristic regime and attempt to break bread with them. Instead, we utterly annihilated that state and rebuilt Japan from the ground up as a country that was friendly to us and our interests. And this has had benefits for both countries. And so the argument that Crystal makes is, you cannot break bread with your enemies. You need to be able to distinguish your friends from your enemies. Finally, for a great power, the national interest is not a geographical term. Smaller nations might appropriately feel that their national interest begins and ends at their borders, so that its foreign policy is always in a defensive mode. A larger nation, however, has more extensive interests, and large interests whose identity is ideological, like the Soviet Union of yesteryear, the United States of today, inevitably have ideological interests in addition to more material concerns. So what's the argument here? The argument is, small countries have a national interest that really begins and ends at their borders, right? Keeping stability within their borders, pushing their economy within their borders. But larger nations, hegemonic nations, great powers, as Crystal calls them, have larger concerns and, more importantly, ideological concerns. They seek not only to push their national interests, but their ideological interests as well. The United States began to export and promote democracy. The Soviet Union began to expand and promote communism. These are more than just national interests, they are ideological interests. They are not doing so just because it would be good for their country. They are doing so because they believe it is consistent with their values. This is both somewhat a rebuke of realism. Who, if you recall, realism tends to view all countries as those smaller nations whose national interests begin and end at their borders. But it also is a smart integration of norms that we looked at when we talked about constructivism, right? Ideological interests are essentially norms. There are no rules surrounding it, and yet we incorporate this stuff into the theory. Essentially, neoconservatism's main conceit, its main point, is that realism, quote unquote, thinks too small in a world that has global instabilities. Defensive militarism, the kind of militarism that is advocated for by realists, both classical and neo-realists, is impossible in the modern world. That's not an option. The world tends to make its problems your problems. And so we must be proactive in dealing with threats. Hence the question, what do we do? Well, here's the three main theories that at least have made up American foreign policy. For realists in the world system, you use military power to project your strength, but you only engage with the world defensively. Preemptive action is not an option, and so the national interest simply becomes that which advances national defense, not norms, not ideologies. So long as it keeps the country safe, it's good. For liberals, however, they use economic power to project strength, and they engage with the world somewhat proactively. But we do this to build interdependence between countries and promote democracies. Why? Because long term this will make peace an inevitability. When we're all interdependent with each other and we're all democracies, the world system becomes more stable and more peaceful. And while military conflict is an option, it is one that should be avoided at all costs. Neoconservatism tries to fuse these ideas together, and it argues that we should be using military power to project strength, but we also should be engaging with the world proactively. In fact, we engage with the world both aggressively and preemptively in order to both promote democracy and Western ideas. And we do it this way because military conflict is not the option to be avoided. It's the only option that works. Crystal and Kagan in National Interest and Global Responsibility argue, in fact, that the 1990s, for all their peace and prosperity, were a squandered decade. The decade that began with America's triumph in the Cold War and its smashing victory in Iraq and Desert Storm. In the wake of those twin triumphs, the United States had assumed an unprecedented position of power and influence in the world. By the traditional measures of national power, the United States held a position unmatched since Rome dominated the Mediterranean world. American military power dwarfed that of any other nation, both in its warfighting capabilities and its ability to intervene in conflicts anywhere in the world on short notice. Our country, in other words, was, or could have been, present at another creation, similar to the one after World War II. For the first time in history, the United States had the chance to shape the international system in ways that would enhance its security and advance its principles without opposition from a powerful and determined adversary. Essentially, the argument is that in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War and the end of the Gulf War, the United States had the opportunity to go out into the world system and truly dominate the world system as neoconservatism proposed. Remember, the only way to stabilize the world system is to dominate the world system. And we had the opportunity to do so. But we didn't. That's not what we did in the 90s. Instead, in the 90s, we fell back. Now, we talk about the 1990s as an era of odd fashion, but most importantly, economic prosperity, at least here in the 1990s, in the United States, anyway. What we did not do, what we often refrain from doing, is looking at the world as a whole during the 90s and asking ourselves what the world legitimately looked like during the 90s. And what you will find is that, unlike what you might think, the world did not become more stable, it became less stable. We had 2 whole genocides in the 1990s. First in Bosnia, and then in Rwanda. We had civil war all over Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The former Soviet countries, Russia in particular, began to eat each other in a rat race that led to oligarchy and corruption. The United States, at the moment of its greatest hypothetical triumph, according to neoconservatives, abandoned the world and thus created an atmosphere for the biggest instabilities that still ripple to this day. Our lack of action after the Cold War is the reason why we have major instability all over the world, because the effects of that decision have rippled into the 21st century. So what do we do instead? What should we have done instead? Well, you will recall from our class on neoliberalism that neoliberals attempt to promote stability through economic development, what we called democratic development theory, the ideas that come out of Seymour Lipset. Neoconservatives, by contrast, promote stability through regime change. What's regime change? Well, simply put, regime change is a process through which hostile, illiberal regimes are instead replaced with democracies. Because the general understanding is democracies are going to be favorable not just to Western interests, but to American interests specifically, both strategically and ideologically. The argument they give, for example, is, let's say we had taken the opportunity to remove Saddam Hussein in the 90s, after the first Gulf War, not the second Gulf War, the first one, the one under George Bush Sr. In the 2000s, what we may have had is a more stable, America-friendly region in the 2000s. We may not have had to go to Iraq a second time, allegedly, according to neocons. I have thoughts on this, but I'll keep them to myself. And so if you compare regime change to democratic peace theory, what you get are surprisingly similar views on the world, but that promote drastically different courses of action, right? For democratic peace theory, the idea is that democracies don't go to war with each other, either because of economic interdependence, but also because of social and political ties. This means that democracies tend only to go to war with non-democracies because they just lack the incentives to not do that. So in order to promote a more stable and universal peace, neoliberals try to promote democracy wherever possible. This is done mostly through economic development and global institutions. We invest in the economies of non-democracies, not because we want to be friends with them, but because we want them to be democracies one day. Well, neoconservatives take the complete opposite tack, but it ends up sounding rather similar. America, being the world's most powerful democracy, at least militarily, has therefore an obligation to promote democracy. This is both because of its national security interests and because of its ideological imperatives. And so, in order to achieve a more stable peace, a more universal peace, neoconservatives seek to promote both democracy and Western values, and this is the important one, by any means necessary. And especially because neoconservatives distrust the power of global institutions, this should be done exclusively through military action. Neoconservatives believe that you should intervene, however and whenever possible, to promote democracies by any means necessary. It is simultaneously our national security imperative and our ideological imperative. So I hope that made sense. I hope that conversation on neoconservatism explained the theory to you. Remember that this is not an endorsement of the theory. It is simply an explainer. That's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.